Welcome back to Stay Tuned, supporting transition age youth. This podcast is brought to you by the Transitions to Adulthood Center for Research at UMass Chan Medical School, Department of Psychiatry, and in partnership with our research sponsor, the National Institute for Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. I'm your co-host, Emily.
And I'm your co-host, May.
And today it's just the two of us. We're going to be talking about ADHD.
Yeah.
And what it's like getting diagnosed later in life and how it shows up differently in women and like all that type of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Emily and I were both actually recently-ish diagnosed with inattentive ADHD. And it's been really eye-opening. I think we've had like some conversation before about how our ADHD has always sort of affected us, and we didn't realize like, oh, that explains that. But since having this diagnosis, it's definitely shed a lot of light on like why I was the way I was as a kid and how it impacted me in school and how it has been impacting me at the workplace. And yeah, so we'll get into a lot of that sort of stuff.
For me, it was like, I think it was about a year ago at this point. Yeah, like a year and a couple months maybe. And I feel like like for a few years, I have been like, okay, like there's something else besides just like, anxiety, depression. Like I was like, there's definitely something else going on. But like I didn't really know what it was. And then I was actually like, when I was talking to my therapist about it, like she also has ADHD and she actually recommended me to get like tested for it. She was like, it seems like that might be what you're dealing with. And she was right. And so I got tested for it. And yeah, and so I have inattentive ADHD, which is basically like I feel like when most people think of ADHD, they think of like the like hyperactive, like, you can't sit still in your seat and like you're disrupting class and like all that type of stuff. But inattentive is like it's almost like the opposite in a way where it's like it's very like internal, I feel like. So it's like hard to pay attention and I'm definitely like easily distracted or like it's hard to focus. And like for me, like I feel like I'm just kind of always pretty like low energy and like exhausted a lot of the time. Definitely have struggled with like procrastination and like some like time management, stuff like that. But like these are things that I've always dealt with. And I think one of the things for me that like made the most sense, like when I got like looking back on my childhood and everything, when I got diagnosed, is that I feel like when I was in school, like elementary school and middle school and everything, I feel like because I was like a pretty like good student and everything, like I was smart and everything. I wasn't like straight A, but like I was definitely like, A's and B's. But whenever I would get things wrong on like a test or whatever, like for the most part, a lot of it was like careless errors. And so and it was things that like I just like didn't notice in the moment and like it just like didn't quite click. But then when I looked back on it, I was like, oh yeah, like
Yeah.
duh, like it felt very obvious. And I feel like that was kind of like a very common theme for me for like tests and things. And then like that sort of clicked when I got diagnosed. I was like, oh, that's probably an ADHD thing. Like those sort of like
Wow.
careless mistakes. So that was one of the big like main things where I was like, oh yeah, like this is definitely something that I've always dealt with. And like I
Mhm.
was definitely like a daydreamer in class. But it's like these are things that like the teacher like wouldn't really pick up on. And like I didn't realize like there was something different. Like it was just kind of like that's just how I am.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally get that. Thinking back to why teachers never picked up on any of it, and I truly think it's because we didn't necessarily present as like quote unquote problem children. Like
Yeah.
the kids who it was clearly obvious in were the kids that like couldn't sit down and like were always speaking out of turn and that sort of stuff, throwing things, like, they were a lot more, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, distracting.
Disruptive, yeah.
Disruptive and distracting. Whereas, like, I think it's really easy for those with inattentive ADHD to sort of slip under the radar and, it's like, "Oh, we're not creating problems in the classroom," but, maybe, and, like, we're not getting horrible grades either, so that's just how they are, like, it's fine. So I really relate to that. I think I also had a similar thing happen where I was also like a B plus, A minus student. Like, and all of my issues are always like really careless mistakes. Um,
Yeah,
and like I've always excelled in writing and English, and the actual content was always really good, but where I would always lose points was on grammar and like the bibliography, because those are all like the very detail oriented aspects where that's just the sort of stuff my brain totally tunes out. And then even in like math class, I remember getting this feedback once that I always take the longest way of doing a math problem. And because of that, I make careless mistakes within like the longer process of getting there. And so had I yeah, like the process is technically right. And had I like not made careless mistakes, I would have gotten the right answer. Um,
yeah.
but
Yeah, no, I'm the same. Well, similar because like with math especially, like math was always my worst subject. Like I was always terrible at math.
oh,
And if I did, like sometimes I would get questions right, but it would be like the teacher would be like, I don't understand your process here. Like you got it right, but I like can't understand how you got there. Or I just like wouldn't get it right at all. And like it was so far off. I'm like, I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. But for like writing, like English was always definitely my favorite subject. And the hard part for me was like, especially with like essays and stuff, like the hard part for me was like getting started. I would always start at like the last possible minute for essays. And then, yeah, like I would sit down and I would finally like get myself to do it after procrastinating for, hours or days or however long it had been. And then I would write it all in like one sitting and like not take any breaks and like just like get all of it done at once. And like obviously that's not a very like efficient way to write essays or like, get your work done. But like that was always just my process because I like could not do it any other way. Like that was the only way that worked for me. And I feel like that's definitely a very like
I really relate to the procrastination and doing everything at the last possible second and like sitting down and doing everything in one sitting. Whereas like in school, they always told us to do the opposite, like
yeah.
start at like early when we first assign it, do a little bit every day, do a first draft, then a second draft, then a third draft. And I'm like, my first draft is my only draft.
Yeah. Yeah, or like I'll do the first draft and then I'll immediately go into the final draft. Like
Yeah,
I'm
yeah, yeah.
do it all at once.
And I saved it till the last second, so I never had time to do more than one draft, honestly.
Right.
Oh, yeah, and then, like, I always chalked it up to, like, I guess I'm just a procrastinator, like, um, my friends would always say, like, You really stress me out the way you do assignments," and no one ever wanted to study with me either, do work with me because I would always, like, start side conversations, or I would always distract them, I couldn't focus on my work, and I would go on my phone instead, and, like, I always was, like, super frustrated at myself, and I always felt like a bad student because of it as well. Because like, I would see my friends, like, they'd get home after school, and they would, like, have a snack and then just pull out their homework and start doing it, and then they'd have the rest of the afternoon and night to just, like, do whatever. And,
Yeah.
like, I always took that as, like, gosh, I'm not a good student. Like, I don't start my work right when I get home. I like take hours and hours and hours and hours and hours to do one task because I stop and I start and I stop and I start. And like I just
Yeah.
can't get myself in that like flow state of mind where like I just get like really into something. Like it was very hard to get into that like very focused state. And so there was a lot of shame that came with schoolwork and like, now I've been working with my new psychologist, talking about how I don't think I mean, yes, I've had depression in the past, but currently I don't meet criteria for depression anymore. And I think looking back, a lot of my depression stemmed from my untreated ADHD because I just felt so ashamed and down about like who I was as a student and never feeling good enough. Especially coming from a school district that's like very, very competitive, and the popular kids were smart kids, like
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I did my internship this year in your town that you grew up in, and it was very academically rigorous, so I can definitely see how that would take a big toll on you for sure. Do you feel like that also, like, followed you into, like, college and everything too?
1,000%. Growing up, even, like, elementary school, the academics started for, like, literal six-year-olds. My mom put me into, like, extracurricular math classes. I had a math tutor. I had English extracurricular classes. Like, it just never stopped, and I was just always faced with something that I felt like I was bad at or I wasn't doing correctly like the other kids around me were, and so I definitely took that into college, and then in college, I went to a pretty rigorous university as well, and I was surrounded by kids who, like, wanted to do well and were doing well, and so always comparing myself to them, and then feeling like, I initially picked biology as a major, and that was a lot of, like, math and science that, like, has never been my strong suit, um and so, like, getting myself to sit down and study was always really tough, and then, the shame of feeling like I'm not good enough to major in biology, um, came around, and so, yeah, I definitely still take that mentality that, like, I am just inherently a stupid person around. I don't think that's kind of, like, one of my core beliefs despite, like, intellectually knowing that that's not the case.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I don't think that you're alone in that either. Like, I feel like there are a lot of people with ADHD, especially if it's like diagnosed later in life, where like that is a core belief, and they are like, oh, like I was just never good at school, and like so there must be something wrong with me. But it is like, like our brains are literally wired differently. Like we were not set up for success in that traditional way. And like for us, especially like with inattentive ADHD, it's like it does go, unnoticed the majority of the time. And like it is kind of like on us, like when we're older to realize like, okay, there's something else going on. Like maybe let's try to figure out what it is, you know? And like I feel like for us too, like we're in the mental health field, so like it is a bit easier for us to focus on that stuff and to actually want to figure out what it is. But I think there are a lot of people out there who, like they've just gone their whole life with this, like undiagnosed, untreated, and they're like, yeah, that's just who I am. And like that definitely can contribute to those core beliefs. So like I'm stupid or like I'm not good at these certain things or like whatever it is. I feel like I'm sure that's a very common thing.
Yeah, yeah, and, like, just general low self-esteem because a lot of
Yeah.
your value is placed in, like, who you are as an employee or as a student, depending on, like, how you grew up, but, yeah, it definitely has the potential to create a lot of harm for oneself, and, like, to your point earlier about, like, how you had to sort of advocate for yourself and, like, realizing like, "Huh, there might be something else going on here." The other huge piece was, like, time management, because there's no set schedule anymore. Like, you kinda have to manage your own tasks and, um, organize yourself and orient to yourself, and that became really, really difficult to the point where there was no system. It was just, like, whatever
Yeah.
you can remember to do, just start that. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
it was a mess, and so I think, I've always suspected and I've always joked like, "Ugh, it's ADHD, isn't it?" And then one day I was like, "Wait, but what if it's really ADHD?"
Maybe I'm onto something here.
Yeah, right? Is that
Yeah.
was when I changed psychologists, and, um I, like, brought it up to him, and it was the first time I ever seriously brought it up, and he was like, "Let's explore this," and then we just sort of talked through it, and he was like, "This is sounding like a classic textbook case of ADHD. So then I brought it up to my psychiatrist, and then I was diagnosed from there. But it's really funny how, like, I was so insecure about myself that I even doubted the validity of, like, having ADHD, um,
Mm,
because I
yeah.
I really just thought that I was a stupid, like, messy person.
I feel like for me, a lot of it is, like, I'm so used to just not having that motivation and, like, being a procrastinator and struggling with time management that I felt like that was just me, like, that's just who I am, and so and because, like, I did go so long, undiagnosed and, like, I made it through the majority of school, like, I got diagnosed, it was, like, right before my last year of grad school, so, like, my last year of school, I've been through all of school, my whole life, and so I was like, "Okay, well, like, I've managed fine up until now," like, I've made it work. Maybe it has been a lot harder for me than, like, other people, and, like, maybe, I didn't quite realize how much harder it was for me, but, like, that's what I was used to, and so it feels very hard for me to kind of accept and, like, even, like, think about, like, potential, like, accommodations and, like, even, like, with medication, I was kind of, like, iffy at first because I was like, "Well, like, how much is it really gonna do?" Like, "Is it even worth it?" Which, like, it is, like, I'm on it now, and I've found, like, what works pretty well for me, at least, and, like, it definitely does help, but, like, even now, sometimes I'm like, "Well, I'm fine, like, I don't really need to, like, I
Yeah.
don't need accommodations, I don't need, like, all this stuff, like, I've figured it out up until now, and I feel like maybe that's part of, like, the self-esteem thing too, where it's like, "Okay, like, this is just who I am," you
Yeah.
know? But it's like,
No.
"Okay, well, like, this is just a way that, like, my brain is working differently, and there are ways that we can actually help make it easier and not have to, like, struggle and, like, feel exhausted all the time and, like, feel unmotivated all the time," you know?
Yeah, yeah, I totally get that. Cause for us, I think, like, those types of struggles, like, it's not it's normal for us, like, that's just
Yeah.
we never really thought anything of it until, like, the diagnosis came up, and then, that's when it really solidified, like, "Oh, life actually isn't like this for a lot of people."
Right.
So it's just, like, you're so used to the struggle that you don't even realize that it's a struggle, like, you just that's how I
Exactly.
live my life, like
Yeah, no, exactly, I, like, didn't even realize that I was struggling because that's just
Yeah,
what I was used to, and, like, for me too, like, I'm from, like, a smaller rural town, and, like, the school system that I went to, like, definitely wasn't bad, but, it wasn't great, and it wasn't, like, super prestigious or anything, it was just, like, Southern public school, like, could be worse, but definitely could be better. And so I feel like a lot of the people, my classmates and everybody that I grew up with, like, obviously there were a lot of people who, academic stuff was like really important to them and they were really trying really hard to like be top of class and everything. But I feel like the vast majority of people like, it wasn't the number 1 priority, or it wasn't super pushed on them by, like, their parents, like, they didn't have that external pressure to, like, do really well in school. So, like, if they weren't the best student, like, it wasn't the end of the world? And obviously, like, I'm sure there are a lot of people in my hometown who would beg to differ, and I'm just, like, generalizing things, but I know for me, like, kinda looking around at, like, my classmates, like, growing up, I didn't feel that, like, sort of competition necessarily, and so I didn't really feel like, you know, "Oh, like, I really need to work hard to, like, catch up to everybody else around me," which I imagine is what you were kinda feeling when I can imagine how, like, difficult that would be too.
100%. Like, I sometimes wonder, like, how would I have turned out had I not gone to such a academically rigorous and competitive school system? Like, I really do think it did more harm than good, and not just for me, but for everyone, and you don't even have to have ADHD to have been affected really negatively. Our mental health stats were, like, really, really high. Um yeah, there was a point where, my, like I think it was my senior, junior year, they called it the rock room, and it was this zen space that they put, like, board games in, like, salt lamps, like dim lighting, meditation music. Like it was supposed to be an effort to help out the mental health crisis that was happening. But it was really just this band-aid solution. Like what was really happening underneath was like it's a pressure cooker. It's just the amount of pressure these kids are put under is ridiculous that anyone would come out with, like, issues after that,
Yeah,
so just being around that and being someone who was really struggling to keep up, had dire impacts on my self-esteem, and like I said earlier, like, I'm going to carry that with me probably forever. What I wanted to know was, like, once you went on medication, did you notice a difference in, like, how school was for you, compared to the previous years?
it's hard to say because I think once I got to my grad program, I think school in general was just, like, much easier for me, and I think that is because I was, like, really focused on, like, one subject that I knew that I was passionate about. And I did really like, my cohort and, like, my school and everything. Um, I think if I was, like, back in, like, undergrad maybe, and I was taking a bunch of different classes and, like, I had, like, exams and stuff like that and, like, finals, then I feel like I probably would have noticed more of a difference, because it's definitely, like, easier for me to just kinda, like, sit here and, like, focus, um, I feel like I have, like, a little bit more energy when I'm medicated and, like, not a ton, honestly, like, I for me personally, I know that it's different for everybody, but for me personally, like, medication, like, the ADHD medication at least, like, doesn't have a super big impact on me. It's definitely, like, a little bit, but I feel like it gets me to, like, a very low, like, baseline, like
Mhm.
which for me, like, compared to what I felt before, it's definitely helpful, but I still don't feel like I'm 100%, like, where I could be, and maybe that's just I still need to, like, you know, play around with it with my
Yeah.
psychiatrist and everything, but I feel like right now I'm, like, good enough. And it's kinda hard to be like, "Okay, well, like, should I, try something else, or should I just kinda, like,
Yeah.
almost settle for, like, what is, like, working right now and, like, again, like, good enough?" Because I did also, like we tried, like, several different medications, like, whenever I got diagnosed, and I feel like the one that I finally landed on and, like, the dose that I landed on, yeah, like, I was kinda like, "Okay, like, this'll, this is good enough." Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, and, like, maybe, down the line, I'll try something else or, something else will work better, but for now, I'm kinda just like, "Okay, I found something, I'm just gonna stick with it, I'm just gonna, you know,
Yeah.
hope that it works in long term."
A part of me, like, wonders, what 'cause it's a little complicated because you have depression and anxiety. Because I imagine there's, like, a lot of overlap in symptoms with the depression, anxiety, and ADHD, and, like, it gets really messy. So, I
Yeah,
imagine ADHD meds are only going to take you so far when
right.
you are also struggling with depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms. So, I mean, it probably is a little more complicated in that case.
Yeah, well, yeah, and also, like, you had mentioned earlier that, um, like, you used to be diagnosed with depression and, like, aren't anymore. I feel like I'm similar, like, when I was younger, I definitely had more of depression, and I think in the past few-ish years, like, it hasn't been as big of a struggle for me, but I think something that I've noticed for me personally is that my depression really shows up when I'm bored. And
Hmm,
I think that's definitely an ADHD thing too, like, if I'm really bored and I just, like, am, sitting in my room just like, "Oh, like, I don't like, there's nothing to do," then I feel like that's kind of when the depression shows up.
that's so
So I feel like it definitely could be connected, which yeah, it's interesting how, like, everything overlaps in that way.
Mhm, mhm, for sure. And it's interesting how, like, different people can have, like, the same diagnoses, but be affected differently too. Because like,
Yeah.
for me, I thrive when I have nothing to do, like, I really thrive. I'm a
Yeah.
I'm a bed rotter, like, it's my
I
passion.
am to an extent. and then it reaches a certain threshold, and then all of a sudden it's like, "This is terrible for me."
That's no, that's also a great point too, because like, if I do bed rot for too long, I do start to feel really, like, yucky and, like,
Yeah.
even, like, almost disgusted by myself sometimes because
Yeah.
I can't get myself to snap out of it.
Right. No, it's like you literally, like, cannot get up.
You're stuck. You're literally
Yeah.
stuck. Your brain is screaming at you, "Get up, go brush your teeth, go, like, take a walk, go do anything," but you're just stuck in bed scrolling, and I used to think that was a depression thing too, but it's definitely an ADHD thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be both, but yeah, I'm the same way where especially like on like weekends, if I let myself, just kind of rot in bed and
Yeah,
just sleep in and everything, after a while, it's not fun anymore and I'm like really not having a good time and I like want nothing more than to just get up out of bed and I like cannot do it and it's
yeah.
terrible.
It
And then when I finally do, I like don't feel great. And I feel like it just starts my day off bad.
feels like you wasted your weekend.
Yeah, exactly.
I really get that. Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to talk about was, your depressive symptoms start when you're bored. For me, my depressive symptoms always came up when it became a really stressful period of school for me, and I think that's why I no longer meet criteria because I haven't been in school and, like, this job is pretty, like, low stress for the most part.
Yeah.
So, I think, like, if I were to go back to school, like, I think my depression would come back. Um
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, like I feel like when I'm very like stressed also and like if I'm just really anxious for like an extended amount of time for whatever reason, then that's also when my depression shows up.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you were talking about accommodations earlier too, and, like, I related so much to that about not even knowing what accommodations would help me out because this
Yeah.
has just been my mode of operation for 24-ish years, like
Right. Which is ironic because like at our job, like that's such a big thing that we focus on is accommodations. But I'm also similar where I'm like, I don't even know what I would ask for, you know? Like I'm sure it works for other people, but like I
yeah,
don't know if it would make a difference for me or if it's worth it to ask.
I get that. And then, like, I know because my brother has, ADHD, but his type is hyperactive ADHD, so growing up, he was diagnosed as a child, and in school, he would always get extra time for everything. But I remember him saying, like, extra time isn't even helpful for ADHD because during that extra time,
It
you're
almost makes it worse
right? Like, you're
because
just gonna
you
procrastinate
procrastinate.
more. Uh,
Yeah.
extra time doesn't help you focus. Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't really do anything for you. So, I think, because extra time would come to mind with accommodations, but honestly, I don't think that's very helpful accommodation for
Right.
those with ADHD.
Yeah, because I think we kind of thrive with that deadline.
Yeah,
And like I say thrive loosely because it's definitely like, then you get super stressed about it and
yeah. It
yeah.
assists, it assists.
Yeah, yeah. It's what we're used to.
Yeah. I guess, like, minimize distractions might help. Probably, like, being strategic about when you set up your meetings because I know, like, it can be really hard to get into that workflow, and then for me, what I've experienced is, like, once I get into a task and finally have been able to just, like, put my brain on that task and get some good work done, I have a meeting come up, and then I
Right.
have to have that workflow disrupted to go into that hour meeting, and then after
Yeah.
that meeting ends, it's like, well,
Then
I
you
don't
can't
wanna
get back into
yeah,
it.
I don't
Yeah.
wanna sit anymore. I wanna, like, go get a snack. I wanna go on my phone. I wanna do whatever, and, like, getting yourself back into that task is so difficult.
So hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've noticed too for me that like Zoom meetings like really take it out of me because I feel like I have to sit so still. And like again, it's like I'm not super like the like hyperactive, like I'm not very like fidgety, but like I do always have to be doing something like with my hands. Like right now I have my little like I have this
Oh,
little, like crystal kind of thingy that I've been playing with this whole time. I don't
yeah.
know if you even noticed it, but like I've
I
played
didn't
with it.
know.
But I always have to be doing something with my hands. And I feel like on Zoom, I'm just so hyper aware of like looking at myself and, like, my little box, and I feel like I'd just be, like, so still,
Mm,
and then
mhm.
by the time the meeting is over, I feel like I'm just like, like, I
Yeah,
can, like, relax and, like, and then it feels like I'm just, like, a wave of exhaustion. I'm just like, "Oh my god, like, I can't
yeah,
believe I sat there for so long," and, like, I don't know, and then it's so hard to, like, get into other work because 'cause I'm just
yeah,
like, "I need a break now."
yeah.
I've just been sitting here for an hour, but, like, "No, I need a break."
Well, 'cause I feel like it's like all your energy goes into almost like masking and like
Yeah,
presenting a certain way. So then by the time like you're done, like you've used all your energy because you were masking. I'm not as anxious about like presenting a certain way for the most part, like on Zoom, I should say. Like if I want to move, I'll move. Like I think sometimes in meetings, I am always like getting up out of my chair, readjusting, and then sitting back down. I don't really struggle with hyperactivity. I think what it is like, I'm just bored, and so I need, like, a secondary stimulation to actually help my
Mhm.
focus. So, like, for me, this is actually so gross. My thing is is playing with my toes. Like, I'll have my toes up and I'll just, like, play with
Yeah.
them. And
Well,
it's
yeah, no, I mean, I'm always, like, doing stuff, like, with my fingers, so, like, it's
yeah.
similar, I feel like.
It's, like, tactile. I think, like, to wrap up, I do wanna say, like, a big realization I had was a lot of the tools we have in place or, like, interventions we have in place for people with ADHD and medication and just all that stuff. I really think all that being said about, like, how much our ADHD has made life really tough for us for school and work, and all the things that are available to help us. Um, I really think, like, it only is an issue because of the way our society is set up, and it's
Yeah.
kind of frustrating to think about, like, if capitalism wasn't a thing, if the traditional 9 to 5 wasn't a thing, if the high school to college to work pipeline wasn't a thing, I don't think we would feel as, like at least I personally don't think my self-esteem would be as low. I don't think I would suffer so much because
Yeah,
the way our brain works just isn't set up for our current society.
right. Yeah, it's like trying to fit us into a box that's just, like, not
Yeah,
it just doesn't work.
and it's like, at that point, is it is ADHD really, like, a condition? Like, is it really, like, a negative thing then if
If
it's just,
it's, like,
like
indifference.
yeah, and I well, obviously, like, that's where the term neurodivergence comes up because it's not inherently a negative thing,
Right.
but tell me why there's so many interventions to fix our or to help our brain align more with a neurotypical brain then that does work within the 9 to 5 work system.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Yeah, it's like there are probably just different things that would work for us, and, like, we'd be totally fine and not feel, like, burnt out or exhausted or whatever. Um And I think also, like, a lot of the interventions in place right now are geared more towards, like, the hyperactive ADHD, which for the most part, not like 100%, but for the most part, that is, more often diagnosed in men and often, like, boys, like, young boys. And, like, inattentive ADHD is, again, for the most part, more often diagnosed in women and typically, like, diagnosed later on. And so I feel like there's just a lot less research and less I don't know if there's less effort put into, figuring out how to help us out with it, but, like, it feels that way. Um, and I think that's definitely something that, like, researchers listening, like, if you
Yeah,
wanna focus on that and, like, figuring out how to help young girls with inattentive ADHD in school, I think that would be really beneficial because there's a lot more of us out there than people realize, and I think it's becoming more common to get diagnosed now, but for a long time, like, it just wasn't even people didn't even think women had ADHD, or, like, it was just labeled, like, ADD, and, like, it's yeah, it's not always been paid attention to.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
If you would like to contact us, you can email us at staytuned@umassmed.edu and check out the Transitions ACR website at umassmed.edu/transitionsacr. Thanks for being here, and be sure to stay tuned for next.